In a town built on debts and secrets, who holds the power to make the mighty confess what they swore would never be spoken? The church bell's 5th chime still hung in the morning air when Martha Henley stepped onto the boardwalk outside Garrett's Mercantile. She carried her husband's leather saddlebag, the one he'd used for collecting debts, now heavy with something else entirely. The sun sat low behind the courthouse, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers toward the broken-wheel saloon. "Morning, Mrs. Henley." Samuel Garrett emerged from his store, a telegraph message crumpled in his fist. "Train's running 40 minutes late from Cheyenne. Weather, they say." Martha nodded, though her attention fixed on the saloon's front door. 9 pieces of paper hung there, each one carefully pinned to the painted wood. Even from 50 yards she could see the ink dark, deliberate, still damp in places. "Samuel." Her voice came steady, practiced. "Those letters there. How long they been hanging?" Garrett followed her gaze. His face went pale beneath his shopkeeper's tan. "Since before dawn, I'd guess. Didn't see who put them up." Martha shifted the saddlebag's weight. Inside, her husband's ledger, pressed against her ribs, 9 names, 9 debts, 9 men who'd borrowed more than money, and paid in ways the bank wouldn't record. 40 minutes late, she repeated, checking the depot's clock tower. The hands showed 5:20. That puts the eastbound through at 6:50. She walked toward the saloon, each step measured and deliberate. The boardwalk creaked under her boots, good leather, resoled twice but still sound. Thomas had bought them for her 3rd winter in Wyoming Territory, back when debts meant cattle and land, not secrets. A young woman approached from the Hotel Chinese, maybe 20, wearing a blue dress that had seen better seasons, but was clean and carefully mended. "You Mrs. Chen?" "Yes'm." "From the restaurant?" She gestured toward a narrow building squeezed between the bank and the barber shop. "My husband, he cook there. Good food, fair prices." Martha studied the woman's face. Fear lived there, but also something steadier. Resolve, maybe, or just the kind of tiredness that came from carrying other people's secrets. "Your name on one of those letters?" Mrs. Chen's hand moved to her apron pocket, where something crinkled like old paper. "Not my name, no, but my business, maybe. Hard to say what men write when they scared." The depot clock chimed the quarter hour. 5:30. Martha watched the sun climb another degree above the courthouse roof, painting the street in shades of amber and dust. "You know what they're confessing to?" "Some of it." Mrs. Chen stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Men talk when they think nobody understand their words. But I understand plenty." They reached the saloon door together. Martha counted the letters again 9, just as Thomas had promised. Each one bore a different hand, some careful script, others scrawled in haste, one written in pencil that had smeared in the night air. Mrs. Chen touched the corner of the 3rd letter down. "This one, he write in my restaurant. Tuesday night, very late. Hands shaking so bad he spill coffee twice." Martha read the name signed at the bottom. Gerald Ashford, Territorial Assessor. Above it, 3 lines of cramped handwriting. "I took money for favorable land assessments. I changed boundaries on official maps. The count is 9, and I am 1. What did my husband have on Ashford?" "Land patents," Mrs. Chen said without hesitation. "Your husband? He know which parcels get surveyed wrong, which ones get sold twice to different buyers. Assessor Ashford, he take $50 each time to make the papers match up clean." Martha pulled out Thomas's ledger and flipped to the A section. There it was. Ashford, G., $350 collected, 3 parcels, Sweetwater Basin. The second letter bore handwriting she recognized, broad strokes, confident loops. She'd seen it on bank drafts and promissory notes. "William Henderson, First National Bank. I approved loans without proper collateral. I took percentages from depositors' accounts. The count is 9, and I am 2. Henderson," she said aloud, "Thomas always said banking was half mathematics and half theater." Samuel approached, carrying a steaming coffee cup and wearing the expression of a man who'd made a hard decision. "Mrs. Henley. Mrs. Chen. Letters been drawing attention. Folks starting to ask questions." "What kind of questions?" whether they're real confessions or just somebody's idea of justice, whether the sheriff ought to take them down before more people read them. He sipped his coffee, then grimaced. Whether Judge Morrison's fixing to call emergency court. Martha glanced at the courthouse. Morrison's window was empty now, but lamplight still flickered in his office. Mrs. Chen pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket. Not a confession, but something else. She smoothed it against the saloon door, and Martha saw Chinese characters written in precise columns alongside English words, names, dates, amounts. "What's that?" "My husband's records. He keep track of who come to restaurant, who pay cash, who promise to pay later, who talk about business when they think nobody listening." She pointed to Henderson's name. "Bank president, he come every Thursday for lunch. Always count his money twice before paying. Last month, he short 15 cents 3 times. Said he forgot to bring enough, but his wallet full of bills." Martha understood. Small things, telling details, the kind of evidence that made bigger accusations stick. The sun climbed higher, and more people began stirring in the buildings around them. A woman appeared in the hotel window, drawn by the unusual gathering at the saloon. "Time's getting shorter," Martha said. She touched the 10th letter in her saddlebag, Thomas's own confession. "These 9 men, they'll want to know who made them write these confessions, who collected the debts and set the terms." Samuel finished his coffee and set the cup on the saloon's porch rail. "Your husband's been dead 3 days, Mrs. Henley. Folks figure his business died with him. Some business never dies. It just changes hands." The depot clock struck 6. 50 minutes until the train. Inside the Broken Wheel saloon, dust motes danced in shafts of early light that slanted through dirty windows. Martha pushed through the bat-wing doors, Mrs. Chen and Samuel following close behind. Behind the bar, a thin man in shirt-sleeves polished glasses that were already clean. His name was Patrick Quinn, and according to Thomas's ledger, he owed $200 for watered whiskey and rigged poker games. "Morning, Mrs. Henley." Quinn's voice carried the careful tone of a man walking on thin ice. Unusual morning, what with the letters and all. Martha set the saddlebag on the bar. The leather made a solid thud against the wood. "Patrick, you served drinks to those 9 men last night?" "Served drinks to a lot of men last night. It's what I do. But those 9 specifically. Between, say, 10 o'clock and midnight." Quinn's hands moved with practiced efficiency, but Martha caught the slight tremor in his fingers. Might have. Hard to remember every customer, especially late in the evening when the lights dim and the conversations loud. Martha opened Thomas's ledger and found Quinn's page. The entries went back 18 months. Small amounts at first, then larger ones, as the debts accumulated and the pressure increased. "Thomas has you down for watered whiskey, Patrick. Customers pay full price for half-strength drinks, and you pocket the difference. Also says here you run card games where the house odds aren't exactly fair. Your husband was a thorough man, Mrs. Henley, thorough and very observant. He was also fair, gave people chances to make things right before he pressed too hard." Martha traced a finger down the ledger page. "But time's run out for making things right. Train leaves in 40 minutes, and Judge Morrison's already writing up the warrants." Mrs. Chen moved to the window, Sheriff walking this way from his office. He not look happy. Through the saloon's front window, Martha could see Sheriff Walt Brennan approaching with the deliberate pace of a man who'd been roused from sleep by circumstances he didn't understand and didn't like. "Patrick, you got a back way out of here?" Quinn looked confused. "Back door leads to the alley behind the livery." "Why?" "Because in about 2 minutes Sheriff Brennan's going to want answers to questions you're not ready for." Martha pulled out a sealed envelope from her saddlebag. "Unless you'd rather tell him the truth about what happened here last night." Quinn pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked a drawer behind the bar. Inside, a stack of papers, each one folded once and tied with string. "Your husband left these for you. Said if something happened to him, you'd know what to do with them." Martha took the papers, 9 of them, each one marked with a name that matched the confessions hanging on the front door. But these weren't confessions. They were contracts. Agreements signed in Thomas's presence, witnessed and dated, spelling out terms for repayment that went beyond money. The first contract was Ashford's. In exchange for $350 advanced against future assessments, G. Ashford agrees to accurate survey work for all Sweetwater Basin properties and full disclosure of previous errors to affected landowners. Sheriff Brennan pushed through the saloon doors just as Martha finished reading the second contract. "Morning, folks. Mind telling me what all the excitement's about?" Martha held up the contracts Quinn had given her. "They're real, Walt." Thomas documented everything. Sheriff Brennan stood 6 feet tall in his stockinged feet, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from 20 years of keeping peace. He was honest, methodical, and not given to jumping to conclusions. "Mrs. Henley, I'm going to need to see whatever documentation you're talking about. And I'm going to need to understand exactly how your husband came by information that would make 9 prominent citizens confess to criminal activity. Thomas was a businessman, Walt. He extended credit, collected debts, kept records. Sometimes people owed him more than money." She opened Thomas's ledger to a page marked with a red ribbon. Henderson approved a loan for the widow Morrison to buy seed for spring planting. Loan was supposed to be at standard interest, but Henderson charged double because he knew she was desperate. Thomas found out, had a conversation with Henderson, and the widow got her interest refunded. Sheriff Brennan studied the ledger entry. "Your husband was operating as some kind of unofficial regulator?" Through the window, the crowd around the saloon door was growing. Martha could see Judge Morrison approaching from the courthouse, his black coat flapping in the morning breeze. Behind him came Henderson from the bank, and a tall man with a silver mustache who ran the Territorial Land Office. "Time's getting short," she said. "Train leaves in 30 minutes. Sheriff Brennan followed her gossip. "Mrs. Henley, I'm going to ask you directly. Are you planning to leave on that train?" "Depends on whether justice gets done before it arrives." Martha pulled Thomas's own confession from her saddlebag, the 10th letter. She handed it to Sheriff Brennan, who read it slowly, his expression growing more serious with each line. "To the people of Sweetwater Station, I, Thomas Henley, confess to operating outside the law to ensure that the law operated fairly. I collected information on men in positions of trust who betrayed that trust. I used that information to compel honest behavior when honest behavior was not freely given. The count stands at 9, and 9 have answered. I answer as the 10th. Sheriff Brennan folded the letter carefully. "Mrs. Henley, your husband was running a vigilante operation. My husband was running a justice operation in a place where justice wasn't always available through official channels." Judge Morrison pushed through the saloon doors, followed by Henderson and the Land Office administrator. The saloon suddenly felt crowded, tense, like the air before a thunderstorm. "Sheriff," Judge Morrison said, "we need to discuss these letters." The depot clock chimed the half-hour. 6:30. 20 minutes until the train. Judge Morrison had presided over Sweetwater Station's legal affairs for 12 years. He was a tall man with careful eyes and silver hair that he kept meticulously groomed. This morning his usually precise appearance showed signs of strain. His collar was crooked, his tie loosely knotted, and his hands trembled slightly as he set his hat on the bar. "Sheriff Brennan," he said, "I assume you've read the documents posted on this establishment's door?" "I have, Your Honor." "And I assume you understand the serious nature of the accusations contained therein?" Henderson stepped forward. His banker's composure was cracking around the edges. "Sheriff, these confessions are the result of coercion. Thomas Henley spent months collecting information and using it to manipulate honest citizens into compromising positions. Define honest citizens, William." Martha's voice carried no emotion, but her words hit Henderson like a physical blow. "Mrs. Henley, your husband was a criminal. He extorted money and favors from respected members of this community." Martha opened Thomas's ledger to Henderson's section. "William, you charged Widow Morrison double interest on her seed loan because you knew she was desperate. You approved a mortgage for the Garrett farm that included property that didn't belong to the Garretts, then demanded extra payments when the boundary dispute arose. You've been skimming percentages from account holders who can't read well enough to check their bank statements." Henderson's face flushed red. Those are lies. These are records. Martha held up one of Thomas's contracts. Signed agreements where you promised to make restitution to people you'd cheated. Promises you kept, because you knew Thomas would expose you if you didn't. Judge Morrison stepped between Martha and Henderson. Mrs. Henley, regardless of your husband's motives, his methods were illegal. Extortion is a crime, whether it's used for personal gain or what someone considers to be justice. So is corruption of public officials. Samuel moved closer to the group. Your Honor, what about my aunt's land case? How long would it have taken proper legal channels to discover that you were taking money from both sides? Judge Morrison's careful composure slipped. Mr. Garrett, that's a serious accusation. It's also a documented fact. Martha found Morrison's page in the ledger. $75 to rule against the railroad. Another $100 to reconsider that ruling. Another $50 to make the final decision stick. You milked that case for 9 months. Mrs. Chen spoke up. Judge Morrison, you come to my restaurant many times. You and railroad lawyer, you meet there twice. I bring tea. I hear conversation. You discuss how to make case last longer, how to create more billable hours for lawyers. Sheriff Brennan held up his hand. All right, that's enough. Your Honor, I'm going to need to conduct formal interviews with everyone involved. Mrs. Henley, I'll need those contracts and the ledger as evidence. Through the window, Martha could see more people gathering on the street. Word was spreading, as word always spread in small towns. The depot clock struck the half-hour. 6:30. 20 minutes until the train. Martha picked up her saddlebag. Sheriff, I'll cooperate with your investigation. But Thomas left specific instructions about what should happen if these men didn't honor their agreements. What kind of instructions? She pulled out a sealed envelope, addressed in Thomas's careful handwriting, to the Territorial Attorney General, Cheyenne. He prepared a complete report, names, dates, amounts, documentation. If justice wasn't done locally, he wanted to ensure it was done at the territorial level. Judge Morrison stared at the envelope. Mrs. Henley, you're talking about destroying the careers and reputations of men who made mistakes, not committed crimes. Henderson pulled out his pocket watch, a gold timepiece that probably cost more than most people in Sweetwater Station earned in 6 months. The confessions we signed, they were written under duress. Any court would throw them out. Mrs. Chen stepped forward. Mr. Henderson, you come to my restaurant last Tuesday night, very late after bank close. You sit in corner booth, write on paper for long time. Your hands shake, you order whiskey 3 times. When you finish writing, you fold paper very careful, put in envelope. You leave $5 tip on $2 meal. She paused. Man who write under duress, he not tip so generous. Samuel studied Henderson's face. You wrote that confession before anyone asked you to. Hudzu. The pressure had been building for months. Thomas had documentation of every questionable decision I'd made, every corner I'd cut. I couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on work. I kept waiting for him to demand something impossible or to expose everything publicly. But he never did, Martha said. He just watched, documented, made sure I knew he was watching. Judge Morrison sank into a chair. It was the same for all of us. Thomas never made threats, never demanded bribes or favors for himself. He just made it clear that our actions had consequences. The train whistle sounded in the distance. Through the window, Martha could see people moving toward the depot, ordinary travelers with ordinary business, unaware of the extraordinary reckoning taking place in the Broken Wheel Saloon. Sheriff Brennan opened his pocket notebook. Your Honor, I need to ask you directly. Did you accept money to influence legal decisions? Judge Morrison stared at his hands. I accepted compensation for expediting certain cases, for providing priority consideration to matters that might otherwise have been delayed. From both parties in the same case? A long silence. Then, yes. Martha felt something inside her chest ease, like a knot finally coming undone. This was what Thomas had wanted. Not revenge, not profit, but acknowledgment. Henderson spoke up. Mrs. Henley, if we make full restitution to everyone we've wronged, if we cooperate completely with Sheriff Brennan's investigation, will you hold off on sending that report to Cheyenne? That depends on what full restitution looks like. The locomotive's bell began ringing as the train approached the depot. Martha could see passengers gathering their belongings, preparing to board. In 5 minutes she could be on that train, carrying Thomas's report to the territorial capital. Or she could stay and see whether justice could still grow in the place where corruption had taken root. "All right," she said. "Sheriff, you've got 2 weeks to start making things right. If I don't see real progress, real restitution to the people who were cheated, real consequences for the people who did the cheating, then that report goes to Cheyenne." The train whistle blew one final time as the locomotive pulled into the depot. Martha picked up her saddlebag, but instead of heading for the door, she moved to the bar and set it down again. "Patrick, you got any coffee that isn't 3 days old?" Quinn almost smiled. "Fresh pot on the stove, Mrs. Henley, on the house." Through the window she watched the eastbound train stop at the depot, take on water, and wait for passengers who never came. After 10 minutes, it continued east toward Cheyenne, leaving Sweetwater Station's reckoning where it belonged in the hands of people who would have to live with the consequences of their choices. 2 hours after the eastbound train departed, Sweetwater Station had settled into something that felt almost like normalcy. The confession letters had been taken down from the saloon door by mutual agreement among the 9 men who'd signed them. Sheriff Brennan had them now, filed as evidence in cases that might never go to trial but would never be forgotten. Martha sat at a corner table in Mrs. Chen's restaurant, Thomas's ledger open before her, and a cup of surprisingly good coffee growing cold at her elbow. Across from her, Sheriff Brennan reviewed his notes, while Mrs. Chen brought plates of eggs and bacon that neither of them had ordered, but both of them needed. Starting with Henderson, Sheriff Brennan said, "I count 17 separate instances of fraudulent lending practices. The Widow Morrison's loan is just the beginning. He was systematically overcharging people who couldn't read the fine print or didn't understand banking procedures." Through the restaurant window, Martha could see activity at the bank. Henderson stood on the front steps with a stack of papers, talking earnestly with a line of customers who'd formed after word spread about the confession letters. Whatever he was saying seemed to be calming them down. Most people shook his hand before leaving. "Henderson's making restitution," Sheriff Brennan observed. "Henderson's smart enough to know that voluntary restitution looks better than court-ordered punishment." A young man entered the restaurant, tall, clean-shaven, wearing the kind of cheap suit that marked him as either a traveling salesman or a newspaper reporter. He approached their table with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. "Excuse me, I'm James Mitchell from the Cheyenne Leader. I understand there have been some unusual developments in Sweetwater Station involving public confessions and corruption allegations." Sheriff Brennan looked up from his notes. "Mr. Mitchell, this is an ongoing investigation. I'm not prepared to make statements to the press at this time. What about you, Mrs.?" "Henley," Martha said. "Martha Henley." Mitchell's eyes lit up. "You're the widow of Thomas Henley? The man whose investigation led to these confessions?" Martha studied the reporter's face. Young, eager, probably honest, but definitely ambitious. The kind of man who could turn Sweetwater Station's reckoning into territory-wide news. "Mr. Mitchell, my husband was a businessman who believed in fair dealing. When he encountered unfair dealing, he documented it. When people continued to deal unfairly after being given chances to change, he took steps to ensure they understood the consequences." "What kind of steps?" Thomas kept detailed records of financial irregularities, ethical violations, and legal misconduct. He shared those records with the people involved, making it clear that their behavior was being monitored and documented. So he was blackmailing public officials? He was holding public officials accountable for their actions. The restaurant door opened, and Judge Morrison entered. He looked older than he had that morning, but also somehow lighter, as if admitting his failures had lifted a weight from his shoulders. "Mrs. Henley, Sheriff Brennan." He nodded to each of them, then noticed Mitchell. "And you are?" "James Mitchell, Cheyenne leader. Your Honor, I understand you've confessed to accepting payments to influence legal decisions? Judge Morrison sat down without being invited. Mr. Mitchell, I've acknowledged that I accepted compensation for expediting legal proceedings. I've also acknowledged that my actions harmed people who deserved better from their judicial system. As of this morning, I've begun making financial restitution to those people, and I'll be submitting my resignation to the territorial governor within the week. Mitchell's pen moved rapidly across his notebook. Your Honor, don't you think the people of Wyoming Territory deserve to know how extensive this corruption was? The people of Wyoming Territory deserve honest government, Mr. Mitchell. They're going to get it, starting here in Sweetwater Station. Morrison looked at Martha. Mrs. Henley, your husband gave us a choice: face the consequences of our actions privately and make them right, or face them publicly and let others decide our punishment. We chose accountability over exposure. Martha thought about Thomas, about his patient documentation, and his belief that most people would choose justice if given the opportunity. She thought about the eastbound train she hadn't taken, and the report to the Territorial Attorney General that still rested in her saddlebag. Judge Morrison, accountability isn't a one-time choice. It's a daily commitment to doing better than you did before. Yes, ma'am. I understand that now. Mitchell looked around the table. So, what happens next? Do the confessions get filed as legal documents? Sheriff Brennan answered. Mr. Mitchell, justice comes in many forms. Sometimes it looks like trials and punishments. Sometimes it looks like people taking responsibility for their mistakes and working to fix them. Henderson appeared in the restaurant doorway, his expensive suit wrinkled from a morning of processing refunds and adjustments. Mrs. Henley, I wanted you to know 17 families have received full restitution for overcharges and fraudulent fees. The Methodist Church got their building fund money back, plus interest. And I've established a fund to provide free banking services to anyone who can't read well enough to understand loan documents. Martha closed Thomas's ledger and stood up. Mr. Mitchell, if you're looking for a story, here's the one you should write. 9 men made mistakes that hurt their neighbors. 1 man documented those mistakes and gave the 9 men a chance to make things right. In the end, justice was served not through courts and punishments, but through confession, restitution, and community accountability. The clock on the restaurant wall chimed 11 o'clock. Outside, Sweetwater Station continued its morning routine, people working, children playing, life moving forward with the steady persistence that characterized frontier towns. But something had changed in the quality of that persistence. Sometimes the best stories are the ones where people choose to be better than they were. By mid-afternoon, Sweetwater Station had taken on the atmosphere of a town during a county fair, bustling, purposeful, but with an undercurrent of excitement that went beyond normal business. Martha stood on the courthouse steps, watching Henderson work his way through a second line of customers who'd come to claim refunds and adjustments to their accounts. A woman approached from the direction of the Methodist Church, middle-aged, wearing a blue dress that had been carefully mended at the elbows. Mrs. Henley, I'm Sarah Morrison, the judge's wife. I wanted to thank you. Martha studied the woman's face. Worry lines marked the corners of her eyes, but also relief. Mrs. Morrison, your husband made his own choices. I didn't make them for him. No, but you, and your husband. You gave him a way to face those choices honestly. James has been drinking too much, sleeping poorly, snapping at me and the children for months. This morning, for the first time in half a year, he looked me in the eye at breakfast. Mrs. Chen emerged from her restaurant, carrying a tray of sandwiches and coffee cups. She'd been feeding people all day, Henderson's customers, Sheriff Brennan's witnesses, reporters from 3 territorial newspapers who'd arrived on the afternoon train. Mrs. Morrison. Mrs. Chen said, your husband, he good man who make bad choices. Bad choices not make bad man if man willing to fix what he break. From the telegraph office came the rapid clicking of the key as operator Jim Crawford sent messages to territorial officials and family members of people who'd been affected by the morning's confessions. Crawford had been one of the 9, caught selling information from private telegrams, but his cooperation had been immediate and complete. Sheriff Brennan approached from the jail, where he'd been interviewing witnesses and taking formal statements. Mrs. Henley, I've got statements from 17 people who were directly harmed by the actions detailed in those confession letters. Every one of them confirms your husband's documentation, and every one of them is satisfied with the restitution being offered. Martha looked around the bustling street. Henderson at the bank, greeting customers with the careful courtesy of a man who'd earned back his reputation through honest dealing. Mrs. Morrison hanging laundry behind the former judge's house, where her husband would soon run a small legal practice helping homesteaders. Gerald Ashford measuring lots for new construction, his surveys now triple-checked for accuracy. Walt, what matters more, punishment that satisfies legal procedures or justice that satisfies the community? In this case, I think the community is getting what it needs. Samuel Garrett approached, carrying a leather portfolio that Martha recognized as one of Thomas's document cases. Mrs. Henley, I found this in my store's safe. Your husband left it there 6 months ago. Said to give it to you if anything happened to him. Martha opened the portfolio. Inside, detailed documentation of how the 9 men who'd signed confessions had chosen accountability over continued corruption. More importantly, it contained contracts they'd signed with Thomas, not agreements to pay money, but commitments to serve their community honestly. Judge Morrison approached from the bank, his hands ink-stained from helping Henderson with paperwork. Mrs. Henley, I've been thinking about what comes next. Your husband's oversight activities? Thomas believed that accountability should come from within institutions, not from outside pressure. The fact that 9 prominent citizens wrote confessions suggests that consciences were already working, they just needed permission to act. A young reporter who'd been lingering nearby spoke up. So this was a one-time event? There won't be ongoing vigilante justice in Sweetwater Station? There will be ongoing justice, Mr. Mitchell. Just not vigilante justice. Martha looked around the circle of faces. Justice that comes from people doing their jobs honestly, treating their neighbors fairly, and holding themselves accountable for their actions. The depot clock struck 4 o'clock, and the afternoon train's whistle sounded in the distance. Martha realized that for the first time all day she wasn't thinking about leaving Sweetwater Station. The problems here weren't solved, might never be completely solved, but they were being addressed by people who lived here, worked here, had to face each other on the street every day. Evening came to Sweetwater Station, with the soft light of early autumn painting the buildings in shades of gold and amber that made even the most weathered structures look dignified. Martha stood in the cemetery behind the Methodist church. Thomas's grave marked by a simple wooden cross that would be replaced with proper stone when the spring wagon trains brought supplies from the east. Mrs. Chen approached through the cemetery gate, carrying a cloth bundle that smelled like fresh bread and roasted chicken. Mrs. Henley, you eat anything today besides coffee and worry? They sat on a wooden bench near Thomas's grave and ate in comfortable silence while the town's evening sounds drifted across the cemetery. Children playing, horses being led to barns, the distant sound of someone playing harmonica. Mrs. Chen, why did you help today? You barely knew Thomas. Justice not personal, Mrs. Henley. Justice like river, it flow where it need to flow. Help what it need to help. Your husband, he understand that. From the direction of town came the sound of voices, not angry or arguing, but serious, purposeful. Martha looked toward Main Street and saw a group of men walking toward the church. Henderson led them, followed by Judge Morrison, Gerald Ashford, and the others who'd signed confession letters that morning. Mrs. Henley, Henderson said, when they reached Thomas's grave, we wanted to thank you for giving us the chance to make things right. Judge Morrison stepped forward. Your husband could have destroyed us all. Instead, he gave us opportunities to be better than we were. Gerald Ashford held out a folded document. We've established a fund $1,000 to start, contributed equally by all 9 of us. It's to help people who get taken advantage of by officials or businesses, people who can't afford lawyers or don't know how to fight back when they're cheated. A trust fund, Henderson added, administered by Sheriff Brennan and the Methodist Church. Your husband's legacy, but managed by the community he protected. Martha read the document carefully. The language was formal, legal, but the intent was clear. ensure that what Thomas had done privately could be done publicly, with community support and official oversight. "This is generous," she said, "but unnecessary. Thomas didn't do what he did for recognition or memorials." "No, ma'am," Judge Morrison agreed. "He did it for justice. This fund is our way of ensuring that his kind of justice continues, but through proper channels." Henderson opened a wooden box he'd been carrying. Inside, Thomas's ledger, the original leather-bound record of all his investigations and documentation. "We thought this should be preserved, but not as evidence or ammunition. As a reminder of what happens when communities lose sight of their obligations to each other." Martha touched the ledger's worn cover. Thomas had carried it for 3 years, documenting not just wrongdoing, but also the human cost of that wrongdoing. "You want me to keep it?" "We want it kept," Henderson said. "Whether by you or Sheriff Brennan or the church, that's your decision. But it shouldn't be destroyed, and it shouldn't be forgotten." The sun touched the horizon, painting the cemetery in deeper shades of gold and red. In the distance, Martha could hear the evening train approaching from the east, not the one she'd considered taking that morning, but the one that brought mail and supplies to Sweetwater Station's ongoing experiment in frontier justice. "All right," she said. "I'll keep the ledger, but not as a weapon or a threat. As a record of what happened when good people made bad choices, and what happened when they were given the chance to make better ones." The 9 men nodded, their faces grave but peaceful in the evening light. One by one they shook Martha's hand, then Mrs. Chen's, then filed quietly back toward town. Martha opened the ledger to the last entry Thomas had made, written the night before he died, the 1st of September. "The work is finished, or as finished as one man can make it. 9 men will face their choices tomorrow. If they choose accountability, justice will be served. If they choose denial, justice will find another way. Martha will know what to do with the rest. She always knows what's right, even when what's right isn't easy." She closed the ledger and looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Thomas had been wrong about one thing. She didn't always know what was right. But she knew what was necessary, what was possible, and what was worth the effort to achieve. "Mrs. Chen, you want to walk back to town with me?" "Good idea. Also, I think Sheriff Brennan want to buy you dinner. He asked me 3 times if you planning to stay in Sweetwater Station." Martha picked up the wooden box containing Thomas's ledger and headed toward the cemetery gate. Behind them, the wooden cross, marking her husband's grave, stood silhouetted against the evening sky, simple and unadorned, but solid enough to last until spring brought the stone that would replace it. Justice, like stone, was built to last. But like wood, it required tending, maintenance, and the ongoing care of people who understood its value. "Mrs. Chen, I think I am planning to stay, at least for a while." "Good. Town needs someone who understands difference between justice and revenge." Thomas understood that difference. "I'm still learning." "Learning good thing, Mrs. Henley. Mean you're not finished growing yet?" They walked toward town together, 2 women carrying the tools of accountability and the promise of better days ahead. The confession letters were gone from the saloon door, but what they represented, the possibility of second chances earned through honest admission of wrongdoing, had taken root in Sweetwater Station's soul. 6 months later, on a morning when spring was finally driving the last of winter's chill from the air, Martha would stand behind the counter of what had been Thomas's office, and was now the Sweetwater Station Community Trust. The wooden box containing his ledger would sit on a shelf behind her. Next to newer records documenting how the fund established by the 9 confessing men had helped dozens of families recover money stolen through various schemes. But that was still ahead of them. Tonight, as evening settled over the frontier town, Martha Henley walked home through streets where justice had been served not by courts or badges, but by the simple revolutionary idea that people could govern themselves if they chose to accept the responsibility that came with the privilege. They counted 9 lashes that morning. By dawn, 9 confession letters had hung on the saloon door. But what they'd built since then was worth more than punishment or shame they'd built. A community that policed itself, trusted itself, and believed in its own capacity for justice. That, Thomas would have said, was worth all the documentation in the world. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.